You know the Denisovans. Or you think you do. Mysterious ancient humans. Lived alongside us. Left a few bones, gone now. Right, you've heard the headline. But here's what nobody tells you in the headline. We identified an entire species of human being, mapped their full genome, traced their migrations across a continent, found their DNA still living inside millions of people alive today. From a finger bone. One finger bone from a little girl who died in a Siberian cave roughly 80,000 years ago. And not only that, the genes she carried, they are the reason certain people can breathe at 4,000 meters altitude without their blood doing something catastrophic. The Denisovans didn't just exist. They are, in a very real biological sense, still here. And the story of how we figured that out is one of the most genuinely strange detective stories in the history of science. So, let's go back to 2008. Denisova Cave, Altai Mountains, southern Siberia. Archaeologists are picking through sediment layers when they find a tiny fragment, the distal phalanx of a fifth finger. The tip of a pinky, not even a whole finger, just the tip. And in 2010, scientists managed to extract ancient DNA from that fragment and sequence it. What they find immediately breaks the existing model of human prehistory, because this individual is neither Homo sapiens nor Neanderthal. It's something else, something that had never been seen. A whole separate lineage of human being, identified entirely through genetics, with essentially no physical remains to speak of. They named them Denisovans after the cave. They couldn't formally name a new species. The standards for that require enough anatomical evidence, and a fingertip isn't enough. But genetically, they had found someone genuinely new. And here's the thing, the genome of that finger bone told a story. Denisovans were most closely related to Neanderthals. The two groups shared a common ancestor, who split from our own lineage somewhere between 550,000 and 750,000 years ago. But they had then diverged from each other, going their separate evolutionary ways. Neanderthals generally west into Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans east and south, across a range we are still mapping. Same ancient family, very different directions. And then, tens of thousands of years later, both of them met our ancestors again. And things got complicated, because modern humans coming out of Africa didn't just encounter Denisovans and ignore them. They interbred with them. Multiple times, in multiple places. We know this because the genetic evidence is unmistakable. You can see Denisovan DNA in living human populations today, not as a curiosity, not as a trace, but as something real and measurable, and in some cases still under active selection. Melanesians, people from Papua New Guinea and surrounding islands, carry somewhere between 1 and 5% Denisovan DNA. Indigenous Australians carry similar amounts. East and South Asian populations carry smaller but still detectable fractions. And indigenous Americans carry traces as well, a genetic legacy suggesting their ancestors passed through Denisovan territory during the long migration into the Americas. That's not ancient history. It said that's your genome. That's the genome of 1 billion people on this planet. These aren't people who are distantly related to someone who once knew a Denisovan. Their DNA is partly Denisovan, and scientists have now identified at least 3 separate interbreeding events. Not one encounter, not a single moment where things got blurry on the steppes of Asia, but 3 distinct episodes with distinct Denisovan populations, spread across thousands of years and thousands of kilometers, which raises the obvious question, just how big was the Denisovan world? Look, this is where it gets genuinely mind-bending. The physical fossil record is almost nothing. For years, the entire known physical remains of the Denisovans consisted of a finger bone, a toe, and a handful of teeth from Denisova Cave, plus a jaw fragment found at a site on the Tibetan plateau called Siahe, which showed Denisovans were already living at elevation above 3,200 meters at least 160,000 years ago. That jaw came with no DNA. The conditions weren't right for preservation, but protein analysis confirmed it was Denisovan. And then in Laos, a cave called Tamgu Hao 2, researchers found a tooth from a Denisovan child, a girl estimated to be somewhere between 3.5 and 8 years old, dating to roughly 164,000 years ago at minimum. Southeast Asia, a child, thousands of kilometers from that Siberian cave, and then, in 2025, the Harbin skull, a nearly complete cranium recovered in northeastern China, which had been sitting in storage for decades after being found earlier. Large, unusual, not fitting neatly into any existing category. Researchers had debated whether it belonged to a newly identified species they were calling Homo longi, the dragon man skull. Ancient DNA and protein analysis finally confirmed it, Denisovan, the first real face, a skull that actually lets us see something of what this group looked like. And what it shows is a massively built cranium, with a large brain capacity, in some ways more robust than us, and in some ways distinctly different. That's the moment the Denisovans stopped being an abstraction made of DNA and became, finally, something you can look at. Okay, and I want to make sure you're still here for the next part, because this is the bit that actually broke my brain. If you're finding this as fascinating as I am, hit subscribe. We go this deep every single week, and there is always more, because we haven't even gotten to the gene yet. Tibetans can breathe at altitude in a way that most humans simply cannot. You take a lowland person up to 4,000 meters, which is roughly the average elevation of the Tibetan plateau, and their body does something dangerous. It produces too much hemoglobin trying to compensate for the thinner air. Thicker blood, higher cardiovascular risk, worse outcomes, including during pregnancy. Tibetans don't do this. Their hemoglobin levels stay relatively stable even at altitude. They have what's now recognized as one of the strongest signatures of natural selection ever documented in a human population. The gene responsible is called EPAS1. It regulates the body's response to low oxygen environments. And when scientists sequenced EPAS1 in Tibetans, they found something they couldn't explain. The version Tibetans carry is so unusual, so divergent from what any other modern human population carries, that it couldn't have evolved in the Tibetan lineage in the time available. It had to come from somewhere else. So they searched. And the only other genome in the database that matched? The Denisovan girl from Denisova cave. The Tibetan EPAS1 haplotype is almost identical to the Denisovan version, found in 8 to 7% of Tibetans, found in perhaps 1 or 2% of Han Chinese, a trace left over from when Tibetans and Han were still a single population that then diverged between 2,700 and 5,500 years ago, found in essentially no one else on the planet. It was a Denisovan innovation. It became a Tibetan survival tool. Somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 years ago, an ancestor of the Tibetan people had a child with a Denisovan individual, and that child's descendants, the ones who happened to carry EPAS1, could breathe better at altitude. They colonized the plateau. Their descendants are still there, still breathing that thin air, still carrying a gene from a person we knew existed only because of a finger bone, and somehow that's not even the most remarkable part. The most remarkable part is what it tells us about the Denisovans themselves, because for that gene to end up in Tibetan specifically, Denisovans had to have been living at high altitude long enough for that variant to be selected for in their own population first. They had to have colonized the Tibetan plateau, or terrain like it, and spent generations there before modern humans ever arrived. The Siahi Jaw, 160,000 years ago, above 3,200 meters, is almost certainly connected. The Denisovans weren't just passing through the high places. They lived there, adapted there. And then, when our ancestors arrived and mixed with them, that adaptation transferred. And here is what gets me every time I think about it. We still have almost no physical remains. Even with the Harbin skull, even with the Laos tooth, even with years of excavation at Denisova cave, it's a tiny sample from what was clearly a widespread, adaptable, successful human lineage that ranged from Siberia to Southeast Asia, from the lowland tropics to the highest plateau on Earth, for potentially hundreds of thousands of years. We know all of this not because we dug them up, but because a handful of researchers figured out how to pull readable DNA from 80,000-year-old bone fragments and then compared it to genomes of living people and found the match. We reverse engineered an entire chapter of human history from molecules. Recent modeling using the new Denisova 25 genome, a molar found in 2020, dated to 200,000 years ago, yielding a high-coverage genome that pushed the Denisovan record deeper than anything before, suggests that the split between African ancestors of modern humans and the Neanderthal Denisovan lineage happened between 825,000 and 694,000 years ago. That's potentially 50,000 to 100,000 years earlier than previous estimates. One tooth, one genome, and it shifts the whole timeline of our species' origin story. Before we wrap this up, Drop a comment and tell me which part of this actually got you. Was it the finger bone? The Tibetan gene? The skull that sat in storage for decades? Because I want to know what lands and what sends you down the same rabbit hole it sent me down. The Denisovans lived and died and were forgotten for tens of thousands of years. And then we found them in our own blood. That's what ancient DNA can do. And we are only just getting started.